Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. It's just thrilling to be here with you, and especially I love seeing shout outs from across the world. It's, I think, one of the main benefits, shall we say, of our weird, problematic world is that through these virtual lectures, we can reach out and at least virtually touch one another across the globe. And I find that really meaningful, especially in my new role as head of collections here at the National Library, which aims to collect, preserve, and make accessible the treasures from across the Jewish world, as well as Israel, the Middle East, and all the different cultures that Jews have been in contact with throughout the ages. So with that in mind, I want to welcome you to this episode of what we call Matchmakers. And I have to say I really enjoy this series because it invites us, the curators of the library, to choose 3 items that seem to be totally unrelated and to tell a story. And so I have a good story for you tonight, and I want to share that. So I'm going to start by sharing my PowerPoint, and hopefully you can see it. What connects Leo Tolstoy, the Imam Shamil of Dagestan, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, you might ask? I certainly did. So the impetus for this triad came from 2 different places of my work. Several years ago, we had a group of visitors from now the Russian province of Dagestan. They came to the library, and I have to admit I had to look it up on the map. When I was preparing for the visit, I remembered that one of my mentors here at the library, Ephraim Wust, had once told me that we have this very special collection of 29 manuscripts from a scholarly circle in Dagestan, including one with the signature of their leader, Imam Shamil. And so I took out some of these manuscripts for our guests, and they were thrilled. They were thrilled to hear that we knew of their culture, that we appreciated Dagestani heritage and their hero, Imam Shamil. And in turn, they shared with me a little bit of the history of Dagestan, and they specifically emphasized the joint cultural heritage, what they called the joint Muslim and Jewish cultural heritage of Dagestan, because of the very long history of Islam in Dagestan, and also with a very early Jewish connection related to the Khazar region. And I'll touch upon that going forward. The other point of reference and launching point for this lecture came from the article of a colleague here at the National Library, Tamar Ziegman, from our music collection. And she wrote about this Imam Shamil being an inspiration for none other than the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so with these 2 points, very far from each other, I began to craft this lecture. Now, our time together will focus primarily on a particular period of modern history, really the 19th century and Europe, and on this remarkable historical figure, Imam Shamil, which you will learn a lot about. Our first collection item will focus in on who Imam Shamil was as a historical figure. He was a real life historical person. And then the other items are going to help us see how Imam Shamil caught the imagination and sometimes the fantasies of people across the continent and beyond in very surprising ways. I would even go as far as to say that Imam Shamil becomes a lightning rod for the great issues of this time, issues of imperialism and anti-imperialism, struggles for nationalist independence and cultural autonomy, romanticist quests for meaning and spirituality in an increasingly urban and industrial age, and so on and so on. So let's begin. And here are our 3 items, which we will come back to. Now, who was Imam Shamil as a historical person? In order to understand that, we need to first understand history of Dagestan. And here we are, and I'm using my cursor to show you. This is the area of Dagestan, and we'll also refer to Chechnya, which is right next to it, in the North Caucasus Mountains. Now, Dagestan has a long history of being controlled by others. Starting back in the 6th century, Persian rule and leading into conflicts between the Khazars. And for those who remember, I mentioned it just a few minutes ago, the Khazars, which were a kingdom where the elites, the ruling family, and the elites converted to Judaism. And the Persians were in conflict over this control of this land. And then, as you see in this little timeline, starting in 600, Dagestan transitions to Arab rule, begins a long process of Islamization. A few centuries later, the Turkish Seljuks took over, and then the Mongols. Several centuries later, the Ottomans, and then again the Persians, and then in around 1800, the Russians conquering this area. And then we have this rare small moment of local sovereignty, and that was what scholars call the Caucasian imamate. Imam is a title, of course, which can mean leader. It also can mean prayer leader, but in this case, it means political leader, the Caucasian imamate. And there was a 27-year guerrilla war against the Russian Empire. And that is where our story is. So Imam Shamil was the 3rd Imam of this autonomous period, this small sovereign area of local Muslims who had pushed back the Russians. He was the friend and student of the first Imam of Dagestan named Ghazi Muhammad. And in a terrible battle in, I believe, 1832, Imam Shamil was one of 2 people in this community who survived this battle. When it was terribly wounded, ran away, was thought to be dead, and was able to recoup and eventually come back. In his early life, he was a student. He was a scholar of Islamic law, of Islamic theology and ethics. And he also was part of a Sufi order, which was very, very common until today, that scholars were also mystics. And the Naqshbandi order was an international Sufi order that moved through South Asia into Central Asia and across a lot of the Islamic world. There are those who want to claim that this created an international network of independence fighters, guerrilla fighters, depending on which side you're on. But scholars now question how that's so significant. But he was a scholar of law and of mysticism from an early age. When he comes back from the dead and takes over, he successfully united many tribes under Islam and under Islamic law, both from Dagestan and from Chechnya. And unlike the first 2 imams of this autonomous region, he successfully held off the Russians for 25 years. Now, during this time, he became internationally renowned as a guerrilla warrior, as a freedom fighter. He caught the imagination, as we will see, way beyond his local area, both in the direction of Russia and towards Western Europe. Eventually, the Russians did succeed in military victory, and he surrendered to the Russians in 1859. And then he was brought to the Tsar Alexander II. And his arrival in front of the Tsar was the subject of tremendous public fascination. Here was the noble savage being brought to the Tsar. And instead of him being killed or been treated very badly, he was actually exiled to a place called Kaluga outside of Moscow and given a very nice home with modern trappings. And for the Tsar, it was an opportunity to learn the ways of this successful fighter and to show off modernity. And so there he was. There were guards and military officers who accompanied him and who jotted down his memoirs, and memoirs were published both in Russian and by his own children in Arabic, and these were translated to many other languages. And then towards the end of his life, he received permission to leave and to go on pilgrimage, to Hajj to Medina, traveling through Istanbul and gathering crowds as he went. And he arrived in Medina in 1870 and he died in 1871. He is buried in a cemetery of Muslim famous leaders and scholars until today. And I'll even say as an epilogue, Muslims in these regions, and especially Chechens, see him as a hero and as a pioneer of Muslim independence against Russia. So his legacy lives on locally as well as internationally until today. So first I want to focus in on is Imam Shamil and how, if we can get close to how he saw himself through his own writings. Now I mentioned at the beginning that the National Library of Israel has 29 manuscripts from the Dagestani Learning Circle. Just to explain what a learning circle is, it's equivalent in the Jewish tradition of the yeshiva and the paired learning, the chavruta model. In Islamic learning, one learns in what's called a halqa, which is a learning circle of people from different ages who the older students teach the younger students, and it's a place of learning, of oral recitation, memorization, and also of discussion. If I look at our 29 manuscripts together with a much larger collection of Dagestani manuscripts at Princeton, and here I'm benefiting from a wonderful article by Michael Kemper, Amri Saidov, and Natalia Tagirova. They analyzed the Princeton Dagestani manuscripts and referenced our manuscripts because they were all collected and purchased by the same wonderful scholar and collector named Avraham Shalom Yehuda. Yehuda bequeathed his personal collection to us, the National Library, and he sold the majority of his collection to Princeton. And then they analyzed, they have over 100 volumes, 130 volumes, and they analyze these collections in order to get into the mindset of who was Imam Shamil from a religious standpoint. What was he interested in? And what they found was primarily he was a student of law, of Islamic law. And in fact, 20% of the volumes analyzed were connected to Islamic law of a specific jurisprudential school called the Shafi'i school. And what we find there is many, many generations of commentaries on Islamic law, one referring to another, each one carrying what's called the chain of transmission of Islamic law throughout hundreds and hundreds of years, which is very typical for these circles of learning. And it is emblematic of the dynamic way in which Islamic law is studied. And here there are a lot of echoes with Jewish law. What else was there? Well, there was a lot about Quran and about Hadith, Hadith being the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what's interesting, and the article points this out as well, is that for Imam Shamil, Muhammad was a real paradigm. He was a real historical precedent for him. Why? Because Muhammad also fought a brave small group of followers against unbelievers, against the majority. And sometimes he used preaching, and sometimes he used fighting, and sometimes he had to run away. He had to emigrate. And that's in the history of Islam. Muhammad and the original community emigrated from Mecca to Medina to launch their own, to enable their own Muslim society. And that is what Imam Shamil himself did, and what Muslims in this region did. They moved away from the Russian-controlled lowlands into the mountainous regions, which is where Imam Shamil set up his Muslim empire. There was also a lot of books, many books about Arabic. It turns out that Arabic grammar, rhetoric, language was a very important subject for Dagestani Muslims. Yes, they had many other languages, but there was a very strong focus on Arabic. We also have texts on logic and philosophy, theology and polemics. What we're looking at right here from our collection is a book of polemics, intra-Muslim polemics between Sunnis and Shi'is, written by Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, who died at the very beginning of the 16th century. And he actually was a hadith specialist and scholar. And so this is a book that combines Hadith scholarship, again about the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, with insults and invective against the opponents, in this case, the Shi'is. This is a text called Kitab al-Sawa'iq al-Mufrika, which means the burning lightning bolts, which is the sharp criticism of their opponents. And in the circle in the middle, we have here Imam Shamil's own handwriting. Now, some of the volumes that belong to Imam Shamil personally were written by him, and some were commissioned by him or purchased, and then he would write his own name. And here we have at the bottom his seal, his own stamp. And up here it says, Min Kutub al-Imam Shamil, from the books of Imam Shamil. And then we have what's called an endowment deed, a waqfiyya, which is what that he declared that this text would stay in the family and be inheritance to his son. And I'll get back to that in a minute. And so we're looking at a text that was owned by Imam Shamil himself from the early 19th century. Now, there were also Sufi texts. As I mentioned, Imam Shamil was a Sufi, but not as many as we expected. It was more of a focus on Islamic law, which for Imam Shamil was almost the constitutional material for setting up his autonomous regime. Here are two more examples of Dagestani manuscripts in our collection, and they're very distinctive. They're unique almost when you look at them, especially the one on the left. And what we're looking at is a text where they ran out of room to write commentaries and comments and margin notes, and they added paper, and they added extra documents. Now, some of the documents are further commentaries or writing down, remember this scholarly community, these conversations in the scholarly community, and some of them actually serve as a kind of archive for the community and historical documents that were tacked on. That's on the left. And on the right, we're looking at an example of a text where you have the text in the middle, and this should look a lot like Jewish text. We have the text in the middle, and then you have all along the edges margin notes and commentary. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you this was a thriving scholarly community. This was a community that didn't just passively read their texts, but they were actively engaged in making the textual traditions come alive. Okay, so we have a little bit now of a picture of who Imam Shamil was as a scholar. Now, that's what we know internally, and we have attestations from the literature. Now we're going to look at how others looked at Imam Shamil. What we find is that Imam Shamil, being this guerrilla fighter, staunchly holding off the Russians, really captured the imagination of Europeans throughout. We're looking at a record cover of Johann Strauss's Cherkessin March, a kind of folk rendition of a piano composition. And here we have a drawing, a sketch of Imam Shamil and life with the Northern Caucasus mountain folk. Here's another example. We know that Imam Shamil at one point had to come to terms with the Russians, and in order to promise that he would keep the terms of the agreement, he actually had to give his son as a hostage to the Russians. And in exchange, he decided to kidnap 2 Russian princesses. Well, this created an international outcry, and eventually there was the swap in exchange. And here we have another book from our collection, which is an English translation of the Russian expose written by these 2 Russian princesses, because they were in Imam Shamil's household. And so they gave everyone a much desired eyewitness account for life with Shamil. And these were bestsellers. Now, the myths and the stories around Imam Shamil weren't just in his own lifetime. They continued into the 20th century. And we're looking at Leslie Blanche, a writer who tracked down the descendants of Imam Shamil and went to interview them personally in the Caucasian mountains, and wrote what she regarded as her greatest book, called The Sabers of Paradise. Now here we have one of the openings in the middle with photographs, and on the left we have, at the bottom we have Imam Shamil, and here's the Emperor Alexander II. Remember that he was the one who received Imam Shamil when Imam Shamil submitted. And on the right we have his family. So we have, again, this, we have the strong warrior, and then we have the intimate portrayal of Imam Shamil's family. This is an excerpt from Leslie Blanch's The Sabers of Paradise, and it shows how she skillfully took stories about Imam Shamil and turned them into what one can only call a superhero. So let me read this for you. It was dark. By the light of the burning thatch, we saw a man standing in the doorway of the saklia, which stood on raised ground rather than above. This man, who was very tall and powerfully built, stood quiet, still, as if giving us time to aim. This is during that Battle of Gimri, which I mentioned was when Imam Shamil, at an early age, was one of the only two people to survive. Then suddenly, with the spring of a wild beast, he leapt clean over the heads of the very line of soldiers about to fire on him, and landing behind them while his sword in his left hand, he cut down 3 of them, but was bayoneted by the 4th, the steel plunging deep into his chest. His face still extraordinary in its immobility, he seized the bayonet, pulled it out of his flesh, cut down the man, and with another superhuman leap, cleared the wall and vanished into the darkness. We were left absolutely dumbfounded. The whole business had taken perhaps a minute and a half. And so you see here very clear themes of the noble savage, the stoic fighter with superhuman strength. And that is what became his public persona. And this leads us to Leo Tolstoy, our second main item in our matchmaking. Now, Leo Tolstoy was I knew him as a novelist, but it turns out that he took on what one can only call an ethnographic vocation, especially about in trying to understand minorities in the Russian Empire in many different directions. But when it comes to the North Caucasian fighters, it turns out Tolstoy took a position, a very sharp criticism of Russian imperialism. And he did so primarily, first and foremost, through this novella called Haji Murad. Now, Haji Murad was a historical figure in his own right, and he was the lieutenant to Shamil. But because of the very complicated turn of events, he eventually decided to go against Shamil and to ally himself with the Russians, because he was snubbed, and Shamil chose his own son to be his successor instead of Haji Murad. And so this novella gives us the story of when Haji Murad comes over to the Russians and leads the Russians to help conquer Imam Shamil. What's very striking about the novella is the 2 things that I want to point out. Number one, as I mentioned, his ethnographic approach, and that is when you read this novella, then you really enter into the world of the North Caucasian community. Very strong descriptions of dress and foods and customs. And in his treatment of Haji Murad himself and Imam Shamil and the Russian fighters, you get a very subtle, complicated portrait of these people by hearing both their internal thoughts and also the external ways that the Russians saw them. And so we see very clearly the sharp contrast between who these people were, according to Tolstoy, and how the Russians treated them. And you come away with a very strong human sense of who the Caucasian fighters were. Instead of a cardboard, 2-dimensional image of who the Russian enemies were, you come to see the human side. And that is what Leo Tolstoy tried to do in this novel. He starts the novel with almost a personal reflection that gets us into the story. And he talks about this Tatar flower. I noticed in a ditch in full bloom, a beautiful thistle plant of the crimson variety, which in our neighborhood they call the tatar, and carefully avoid when mowing. Why they carefully avoid it? Because, as I tell you on the side, because it's a very strong flower that can mess up your mowing machine. And it's very hard to uproot this flower. What energy and tenacity, with what determination it defended itself, and how dearly it sold its life, thought I, remembering the effort it had cost me to pluck the flower. Now, this introduction is a very clear metaphor for the relationship between someone like Tolstoy as the Russian and this minority culture, the Caucasian people, who he admires them. He admires their tenacity, their strength, their stubbornness. But in the end, he's aware of the fact that the Russian imperialism is crushing them, right? And this is the beginning of Haji Murad. Now, Tolstoy, turns out, was in these regions of the North Caucasus in 1851, and was there maybe as a soldier, but also as a traveler. And so he was traveling in and out of these areas. By the time Imam Shamil was captured in 1859, he had become a real sensation. And we have many images here are two paintings of the capture of Shamil, which are very similar and maybe even were based off of photographs, because we're at a time in the mid-19th century, or the beginning of photography. And so we're witnessing much more modern ways of transmitting information across space. And so we have photographs, we have paintings, and we have newspapers. And I was very struck to see that the capture of Shamil even entered into the Jewish press, the Hebrew press. Here, this is Hamagid, a Prussian Jewish newspaper, and the line says, "V'ata tinpol giboram hanora Shamil biyadea, en od tikva lahem lamod befanea v'yichneu tachat yadea." What does that mean? And now, with the fall of their terrible leader Shamil into their hands, into the Russian hands, there's no more hope for the Dagestani and Chechen people to stand before the Russians, and so they have been subdued. Okay, so we have just moved all across Europe in people who were fascinated by this person, Imam Shamil. He was a great warrior, maybe even superhuman strength. He was someone who was emblematic of the fierce autonomy and the fierce independence against the imperialist forces. So that's one way to look at Shamil and this fantasy about who Shamil was. And now I want to take you to a different direction, and that is, how do we connect this whole story to the Lubavitcher Rebbe? So just a word about the Hasidic community under the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and here we are now in the 1950s, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe had a custom of teaching nigunim. Nigunim are songs without words, musical melodies without words, and he would teach them when the Hasidim would get together on different occasions. And in this occasion, it was Simchat Torah, which we just celebrated 2 weeks ago. Simchat Torah, 1958. This is the end of the Sukkot holiday and the celebration of the Torah. And there are a number of descriptions of what happened. This was at the end of 7 circumambulations, 7 sets of dances. We're in the early hours of the morning, and that is when the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brooklyn decides to teach this nigun. And before he teaches this nigun, he tells the following story. Now, this is just one version of the story he told. Apparently, according to the Hasidic record keepers, he taught this nigun twice on the Simchat Torah 1958. And he told his story slightly differently, and so this is one of the versions. I just shows the shorter version. 100 or 150 years ago, lived in the Caucasus semi-savage tribes. The bold is my emphasis. Okay, lived in the Caucasus semi-savage tribes that were free as a flying bird, and the restrictions of the laws of the kingdom did not apply to them, and even not the limitations of cultured people. So he's taking us back a long, long time, a long, long time ago. And instead of this being the way that Tolstoy described Imam Shamil as the Russian imperialist forces and the minority cultures who are trying to hold on to their autonomy, in the lens of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we have shifted to the civilized world and the semi-savage world, right? We're between the wilds and the civilized. But there's something very appealing for the Lubavitcher Rebbe about these tribes, right? They were free. They're free as a flying bird. When the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, started to expand and enlarge his kingdom, he wanted to conquer also the Caucasus Mountains, but he was unable to, even though there were many soldiers with him. And on the other hand, the tribes were fewer in number. And even though he possessed, of course, better weapons than them, in spite of all this, because the mountains were high, he did not succeed in conquering them. Now, isn't it interesting here that the language of the many unable to conquer the few, which those of you who are familiar with Jewish liturgy would recognize from the story of Hanukkah, where we're talking about the victory of the few in the face of many. That's a very strong Jewish trope. And here the Lubavitcher Rebbe is using that trope when talking about these semi-savage tribes who were free as birds. They were in the mountains, they were high up, and the Russian Empire was unable, even though they were larger in number and they had more weapons, they were unable to capture them. Okay, let's continue. Eventually, they came up with an invention. They made peace with those tribes and promised to the head of the tribes, whose name was Shamil, some concessions. And after the Russians took from them their weapons, they captured Shamil and sent him to exile in the Russian heartland. Okay, so this Lubavitch version of the story is a little different from the historical version that we just looked at. That for Lubavitcher Rebbe, the story is one of a ruse of the larger forces using tricks in order to conquer the strong minority. But in the end, they capture Shamil and they sent him to exile. While in exile, he remembered, now we've shifted into the voice of Imam Shamil. While in exile, he remembered from time to time the high mountains where he was free as an eagle on the skies, and no limitations of imprisonment were imposed on him, and even not the restrictions of the city of settlement, and limitations and shackles of culture in general. And he used to awaken with longing for the high mountains in the depth of his soul. So the Rebbe is putting himself into the mindset of what it means to be a person from the mountains who was captured by the empire and locked away. And in other versions of this story, the Rebbe will go on in describing how wretched the conditions were in this prison cell and how terrible his experience, which again, we know historically was not quite the case. He was in a very nice, comfortable home with a lot of modern trappings, as I mentioned. But again, in this version, in this persona, the freedom-loving, semi-savage tribal leader captured by the establishment, locked into the city, right? This is the freedom of the mountains and the city. And what did he do? He sang a nigun. What did this Muslim Dagestani tribal leader do? He sang a nigun. He sang this wordless melody. And then he used to sing this nigun, whose beginning was longing and whose final melodic movement was hope. Okay, so the Rebbe is taken from this very raw experience of being trapped, and it becomes the arc for a nigun, which is starting with longing and ending with hope. Why? Because of how he now interprets it. Now, this is Imam Shamil. And then we have a description, again, the story that there's a Jew who is walking by the prison cell and overhears this melody. And when a Jew heard this nigun, he translated it into letters or signs and used it in relation to the subject of the descending of the soul in the body. That is, he took this nigun that was based on a free person being captured and locked in to the city and having feelings of anguish, about longing to be free, and ending up with hope that he will be free. In the hands of a chassid, it becomes a metaphor. And what's the metaphor? The metaphor is the relationship between the soul and the body. And now to describe the soul, before it descended into the body, the soul was fixed under the throne of honor, kisei kavod, which is a name for God. And this matter itself is a descending for the soul, right? When the soul comes into the body, the Rebbe explains, it's going down, right? Because it was free before, and now it's getting locked into a physical city, a body, right? So it's descending, because in fact, the soul is higher before, cleaving to the Holy Blessed One himself, cleaving to the Hebrew is Kadosh Baruch Hu, and the origin of her being fixed under the throne of honor is on the high mountains. And so watch how the Rebbe is taking the story of Imam Shamil in the way that the Rebbe understands the story and turning it into a metaphor of the soul, that when the soul was connected to God, it was like the soul was in the mountains and was free. And now it gets trapped in the body. And anyway, it's understood that the soul was totally free and there was no governor or ruler. So this nigun becomes very powerful metaphor for the way a soul feels, because the nigun really is a way that the soul can express herself in the body, that the soul was free in the mountains, meaning connected to the throne of honor, and then gets locked into the body and knows that the soul one day yearns and hopes to be free of the body and to return back to God. According to Lubavitcher records, the Rebbe sang this nigun, told this story, and sang this nigun twice, and then turned to his chazan, who was his, let's say, facilitator of how to teach this nigun to the Hasidic community, whose name was Moshe Teleshevsky. And Moshe Teleshevsky took this nigun and slightly reworked it and then taught it forward. Now this nigun, with this amazing backstory, became very, very well known in Lubavitch circles, with many versions and iterations. Just to show you where this has landed, I mentioned, so the Rebbe taught this nigun in 1958, and here we have a version, I believe, from 2016. And now I want you to watch, and this, excuse me, it's a little kitschy, I have to admit, but I want you to watch how the nigun, which was stripped away from its historical background, right? The Hasidic nigun started out with this historical story about Imam Shamil, but then becomes a metaphor for the soul, right? It's not about the Dagestani Muslim warrior anymore. It's about the soul. And then in this contemporary version, which I took from YouTube, we see how all these threads are brought back. And we're going to see that the imagery that they use is actually taken from a historical version of the Dagestani warriors. Okay, so I'm going to see, I hope it works. And we're going to listen to a little bit of the Nigun Shamil. All right, Doron, can you tell me if you hear it now?
Yes, we do.
Shamil rules his kingdom with pride. His enemies defeated in fight after fight. His advantage is clearly is high. To a false call for peace he agrees to come down, enslaved and imprisoned, his pain knows no bound. Yet his spirit is high, for he knows he'll ascend and be with his nation again. Though it seems so unreal, he is confident and sure he'll rise more than ever before.
So I have to admit, I enjoy that. I enjoy that very much because of how this video and integrates all the different threads we've been talking about. And so let me just explain to you what I see. So this is, first of all, a nigun, right? The idea of a nigun is without words. But this contemporary Chabad Lubavitch version of the nigun is to bring back the words so it can be more didactic, right? And they're bringing back the story of Shamil, which allows us to go all the way back to 1958 when the Lubavitcher Rebbe told the story. And if you notice, the version of the story that is told in this video matches the Lubavitcher Rebbe's version, right? Not the historical version we know, and also not the version of the film that we're looking at, because the film we're looking at is actually a Russian docudrama about Imam Shamil with additions. And so we see here the Chabad, the Lubavitch version of Imam Shamil, which is the noble savage who was tricked by the evil Russian Empire and locked in, which is also supposed to be a metaphor for the way that the soul is locked into the body. And we have, in parallel, at the same time, we have evidence that in Russian culture, Imam Shamil continues to fascinate, that the Russians continue to see Imam Shamil as a very interesting, powerful warrior in his own right, even though he was opposing the Russians. Okay, so this kitschy video brings all these different pieces and shows so clearly how Imam Shamil was such a riveting figure that he could elicit all these different threads at the same time. So I want to close by summarizing how these different items from our collections have led us on this journey. We looked at Imam Shamil, the Muslim scholar and mystic, through historical background and by looking at actual items from his own library and the library of this dynamic circle of scholars. We looked at numerous kinds of evidence from Europe of the 19th century and even into the 20th century of how he was this military hero, guerrilla warrior, and even a person of superhuman strength who could leap over Russian soldiers, pull a bayonet out of his chest and disappear into the night. And then we looked at Leo Tolstoy's very subtle, humanizing portrayal of Imam Shamil and Haji Muhammad Haji Murad as the strong, tragic minority in Imperial Russia. And this leads us into the Lubavitcher Rebbe picking up on this attractive story and taking it in a very different direction, a direction about the metaphor of a soul trapped in the body. Now, here's what's interesting about this whole circle, and that is Imam Shamil himself, as a scholar and the mystic, he would have really loved the metaphor of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That it isn't that the Imam Shamil is being misunderstood here. I think that Imam Shamil would very much appreciate the role of his life as eliciting these feelings of spiritual yearning and longing of the soul to break free of the strictures of the body. And in that sense, this whole journey comes full circle. Even though the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Lubavitcher Hasidim, from everything I have read about the way they understand the story of Shamil, is that there's no recognition that their tradition, their Hasidic mystical tradition, actually is not far from his mystical tradition. And so we, as observers of this phenomenon, can see these ties. We can draw the threads between what might otherwise be pretty disparate ways of thinking about the same subject and the same figure. So thank you very much. It's been enjoyable to take you on this journey. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ukeles. There are a few questions. I think the first one was for me about the recording of this awesome lecture. And absolutely, yes, it has been recorded and you can find it on the website for the reading room, which I have been posting and I'll repost right now. There's a link where you can also see future events and past events that have been recorded. This event will hopefully go online in roughly 2 or 3 days. So one of the questions was, where and how did the National Library of Israel obtain Imam Shamil's document?
Great question. I referenced the collector Avraham Shalom Yehuda, and I have to say he's one of my heroes. Yehuda was a Jerusalem-born scholar and public intellectual who has a fascinating life, which I'm happy to talk about another time. But there were 20 years of his life that his chief occupation was manuscripts and manuscript collecting and selling and buying. We know he traveled throughout all of the Middle East and into Istanbul. He seemed to have very good connections to manuscript merchants in Istanbul, particularly during the 1920s when the Ottoman Empire was breaking up. And so our collection of the Yehuda manuscripts, there are about 1,200 manuscripts, 1,186 to be exact, and they were bequeathed to the library by the Yehuda family, and they are remarkable. And why am I connecting Istanbul to the Dagestanis? Because if you remember, I talked about Imam Shamil traveling to Medina towards the end of his life. And we know that his 2 older sons were kept in Russia, and they actually became Russian soldiers. And here his 2 younger sons went with him. And after Imam Shamil died in Medina, they went to Istanbul and became Ottoman soldiers. And we know from my colleagues at Princeton that that Imam Shamil himself worked very hard to try to collect his books. He took some of them, must have been taken some of them when he submitted, and then we know that he tried to procure either by getting or buying the rest of his collection from the Russian soldier who accompanied him and wrote down his memoirs. And after his life, his son, also named Ghazi Muhammad, spent time in Istanbul trying to recollect Dagestani manuscripts in the collection. And so we believe that Avraham Shalom Yehuda purchased these manuscripts from, if not the son, then the son's descendants. And as I said, sold most of them to Princeton, and some of them came here.
Thank you very much. Nathaniel asked, where does Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari fit in, or is this just Jewish fantasy?
The Khazars were a historical regime, and they, according to historical records, they were the family of the rulers, and the elites did convert to Judaism. And the documentary evidence we have is correspondence with, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name, from 10th century Spain. It'll come to me. And so we have documentary evidence of this regime and other historical records. Yehuda Levi is writing in the 12th century. And so by then it's a fantasy, it's a memory, I'll say that. So the Kuzari uses a historical backdrop for his philosophical narratives. The narrative he tells is his own imagination, but the background is historical. Doron, are there any other questions?
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute. There aren't any more questions that we have time for, but thank you everyone for your questions, and I'm sorry if I missed anyone. I'm going to open all the microphones so that people can personally say thank you. I definitely want to say that there are a lot of compliments, and I will send you the chat transcript so you can see them and read them yourself. Thank you very much, everyone.
I noticed there is a question about how the Rebbe would have known about Shamil, and I want to just use that as an opportunity to recommend the article by Edwin Sarusi, who's a wonderful, wonderful musicologist and who wrote about Nigun Shamil. And he cites several different ideas about how the Lubavitcher Rebbe would hear about Shamil. And that whether it actually was Jews walking by his prison cell, which is probably, you know, more of a fantasy, to Jews hearing this nigun from non-Jewish figures, and it's slowly moving its way to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The name was Edwin Sarusi. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ivan would like to contact you, so if you, with your permission, I will put your email address in the chat room in a few seconds.
Okay.
And for whoever asked, I think it's Marlene, on our website, all you have to do is click on the EN button on the header and you can reach the English version. So I'm going to now open everyone's microphone, and we'll see you all in our next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great. Great thing.
Thank you so much. That was terrific.
Thank you, Dr. Classic. Very good. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Dr. Ukeles, you are going to be looked forward to make many more wonderful presentations. Thank you.
It's very fun to be here and to share these great treasures with you.
Thank you once again, everyone. See you all on our next one.
Yeah.